Thank you for that generous introduction, and thanks for being here and staying awake after lunch. I just want to thank you for organizing. I was very excited to see the other participants. I've read their works and cited them, so it's lovely to meet you both in person and get to discuss a topic that I've been thinking about for, 15 years now. It's too long. Okay, so let's get into it, and I hope my PowerPoint is clear. This is going to be a big kind of overview, and actually if there's any topic that you want to hear more about, if you want to let me know today for our presentation tomorrow, I can bring kind of more text and images because this is such a huge field. Okay, so when I was asked to talk about spiritual beings, I had to kind of decide what was included under the topic of spiritual beings. And I guess I'm more used to thinking about these kind of intermediary spiritual beings or celestial beings, as Professor Friedrich-Ritter's volume termed them. So basically, like, let's say angels, demons, and spirits. So you see I have the English and the Hebrew here, right? Malachei Asheret, or malachim, or malach. Mazzikin or zikim for demons. That's, in rabbinic literature. And ruchot, of course, found in the Hebrew Bible. And rabbinic literature. And in general, after I wrote my book, the way I conceptualize spiritual beings is that they're on a spectrum in the ancient Jewish imagination. In other words, it's not just angels and demons and spirits, but Jews also imagined other beings like Elijah, right, that visits every Jewish household during Passover. Or they imagined, the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs, right, like Abraham and Sarah. They imagined them as people that they could also pray to, and were intermediaries between them and God. If we look at Jewish magic, we also see that in the same prayers, Jews appeal to angels, but they'll also appeal to kind of these folk heroes, a famous rabbi, King David, Solomon, deceased rabbis. So all of these were kind of on a spectrum of intermediary figures that Jews thought about and prayed through and to. So kind of focusing in on spiritual beings, just angels, and demons and spirits, I wanted to bring in a few more terms. Right, so within the category of angels, you have angels of good and peace, malachei tov, malachei asharet, or malachei ashalom, right, good ministering angels, angels of peace. You also have angels of evil or destruction or Satan. We find this in the texts. And I can talk more about that, but I'll just signal that they're there, that they're both considered angels. You have angelic princes. This is particularly in the book of Daniel. We're introduced to the concept of an angelic prince. The prince of the presence, right? Or that's Sarapanim, is an angelic prince. Archangels, the earliest occurrence of this term is in Greek. In Second Temple period texts, again, demons. And spirits, you have unclean spirits or impure spirits, that right we see in the New Testament especially. Hope you can all hear me okay, just signal if you can't. So kind of narrowing down just to angels, there's so many biblical names for angels, right? We could talk about seraphim and chayot and cherubim and ophanim and hosts and the watchers, the camps, the ranks, the marshals, right? That's not exhaustive. Those are just kind of some of the most well-known biblical terms for angels. Whoops. If we look at kind of prose, of course, again, the book of Daniel, you have Michael and Gabriel show up the earliest in the book of Daniel. Raphael is in the book of Tobit. Anael starts coming up in magical texts and poetic texts. In Jewish magic is where we get a lot more esoteric names like Metatron, Abraxas, which is obviously kind of a borrowing from Greek, and a lot of made-up angelic names that seem to be made up ad hoc. In other words, a spell is about conquering demons, so you take the Hebrew verb for to conquer, kavash, you add an El ending, right? El is the kind of shortened form for Elohim, and you get kavashi El. Or You want an angel that will bind your demons. So you take the Hebrew term asar, you add el, you have asarel, asariel, you know. So I think somebody is working on creating a database of all the names, but I wish that person well. That is an endless project. And of course, if you're looking for angels in text, you also have to be aware that there's an angel of death whose name is taboo, and we do not, it is not said. This is apparently an ancient Mesopotamian taboo, that you do not say the name of the angel of death. But in rabbinic literature, the upper realms, the upper ones, the Elyonim, are also angels. Of course, holy ones. If you look at the fixed Jewish liturgy, the Kiddushim is a reference to angels. And while we were talking this morning, I decided to throw in the Shekhinah. Shekhinah is the immanent aspect of God. It's not quite an angel, but as we'll see, the Shekhinah often comes up alongside the angel. So I just wanted to signal that the term spiritual beings, I decided that it didn't include God. So Shekhinah is probably outside of it, but I just kind of wanted you to be aware of it. Okay, so that was a lot of terms. If you went to 4th century Palestine and asked a Jew about these terms, if there was like a hierarchy, if they understood the difference, my sense is that they would tell you that they're all just different words for angel. And I say that because we have this late antique poet named Yanai, and what we see in his liturgical corpus of about 150 liturgical compositions is that he uses these names like they're synonyms, like they're all equated with each other. So whereas if I were a Bible scholar, I would be standing here and telling you about seraphim are actually of an Egyptian origin, whereas cherubim are of a Mesopotamian origin, and they have separate iconography. Your average Jew in the 4th century did not know those differences, right? So I just thought that's my caveat. I'm a late antique Judaic scholar. I care about social history and how angels actually were active in the lives of people. So differentiating these angelic names and terms, I think, is more important to us. We really want to categorize these beings, probably less important to your ancient person, at least until the 10th century. And then in the 10th century CE, we start seeing Kabbalists in particular constructing these angelic hierarchies. But it is notable that it's very late, right? That I think our earliest Christian hierarchy is Pseudo-Dionysus, right, in the 6th, 5th century. So it's pretty late, right? So all of these terms are kind of in the air, and I don't see people too worried about all these different terms for angels or these different imaginings of angels. Oh, sorry, my images aren't coming out so nicely, but hopefully you can see the seraphim and wonderful ophanim here. Okay, so we have our stories from the Torah. So often when I would talk to Jews today, just give public lectures, I would say I study angels in Judaism, and they would say, oh, but Jews don't believe in angels. And I would say, oh, really? What about the story of Jacob's ladder, right, where he sees the angels ascending and descending? Right, would you think about it, if the angels are ascending and descending a ladder, why do they have wings? You don't need wings if you need a ladder, but anyway. Why we have the story of the 3 angels that appear to Abraham, right? Or we have the story of Jacob wrestling an angel. In both of those Genesis stories, the biblical text introduces them as anashim, right? That they were just seeing people. And only later are these people identified as angels, right? Or is it clear that they're an angel because they say something prophetic, like, Sarah will have a child, or something like that. But and that picture up there in the corner is Chagall. You'll see a lot of Chagall in this presentation. Chagall loved angels. Marc Chagall, the painter, a 20th century painter. So one of the most beloved stories in the ancient world was the story of Hagar, when she's expelled into the wilderness, right, twice in Genesis. She encounters an angel who tells her about the destiny of Ishmael. And this was a very important story, of course, because Hagar is just a lowly maidservant, and an angel saw fit to go talk to her and comfort her and tell her that she would be the mother, of of a prince who would produce many nations, and so it's one of those, stories that shows that God cares about the lowly, right? And that angels do come to people when they're in need and feel abandoned, even a slave, even a runaway slave abandoned in the desert. So stories of angels are all over the Torah, but it's very interesting that students today and Jews today are often educated to kind of unread the angels, to not see them in their texts. It's because of Maimonides, right? We should, now that he's not here, there's this sense of like, the angels are Christian or angels are irrational. So like Jews have kind of learned to like not recognize them in their own texts. So often what I'm doing is just reminding them that they're still there, and they were very important to Jews for thousands of years. Of course, you can't talk about the importance of angels in Judaism without talking about Isaiah and Ezekiel, right? So the vision that Isaiah has in chapter 6, in the throne room, seeing the seraphim, right, who say, "Holy, holy, holy." For ancient Jews, that was the most vivid kind of eyewitness report of how God wanted to be worshipped, right? That utterance, the holy, 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 right? Kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. And it became a very important part of the Jewish liturgy, right, and the Christian liturgy. So you have to know Isaiah, Ezekiel, right, his vision of, right, the chariot of God with that very strange polymorphic animal imagery. There's that description of the angels with a straight leg. I don't know if you have seen that. That Jews to this day in the synagogues imitate that posture because they believe that that is the way angels pray, with straight legs. They stand, they, tip up on their feet, so that the words from Isaiah with the posture from Ezekiel are combined in the Jewish liturgy. This is the standing liturgy. It's called the Amidah, 3 times a day to this day. So those are very important. Malachi, because we were talking about prophecy earlier, Malachi is the last book of the prophets, right? And that name just means Malachi. It just means my angel, right? It's not really a name. It's a generic, my messenger, right? Malach it can stand for both human, right, and supernatural messenger. But I thought that was worth mentioning. And again, Daniel, for Christians, it's categorized as a prophet, but of course, for Jews, the book of Daniel is in the writings section of the Hebrew Bible, right? So the rabbis recognized that Daniel was in Aramaic, was kind of late, was kind of weird, but it's crucial because it gives us, the names again of Michael and Gabriel, the recognition that I don't think Daniel doesn't use archangel, but that the prince Michael represents the nation of Israel, right? And it's also where we first are introduced to the idea of Gabriel as the herald of God, the one that goes to, your prophets, right? That's why the New Testament adopts Gabriel for Mary, and probably, right, in Islamic tradition as well. Okay, you all know this, so we can start moving a little bit faster. Second Temple period sources that I think are crucial. Of course, the book of the Watchers, right, from First Enoch, right, where we get the myth of fallen angels. The myth of the fallen angels, it's like there's something so powerful and beautiful about that idea that once it's kind of shared in the world, it transcends every religious community, right? And you don't even have to be religious. It's amazing to me that people who don't know anything about the Bible, like, they know what the fallen angels are. Like, they understand this motif, and I think that's really, it's important, I think, for us to understand that there are some ideas that are too powerful to be contained by one tradition, and angels, like, I think actually kind of embody that. The idea of angelic messengers is just so appealing to people that I think it's quite natural that we find it in almost every society. The book of Jubilees, right, you might know, it's kind of a retelling of Genesis and Exodus by a strange Jew living around 111 BCE, we think. What I love about this text is that it's clearly written by a sectarian Jew who's very worried about what the Maccabees are up to and how they're changing Judaism. It's very worried about intermarriage. But the way it tries to kind of unify Jews is to say, like, you were created to be like the angels. I mean, you circumcised because the angels were created circumcised. It's a really fascinating text. Also, this idea of angels created circumcised shows us, right, that the angels are gendered, right? They're not non-sexual being. They are sexed masculine, at least by this author. Jubilees is, of course, preserved by the Qumran community as well, who, in their text, it's very important for them to assert that the angels are with them. In other words, they seem to be in an argument with priests in Jerusalem who think that the angels are with them in the temple, right? The way Isaiah saw them. But they're like, no, the angels are here with us. That temple over there in Jerusalem is corrupt. We have the pure community, and the angels are with us when we pray, right? And we also see that idea then recur in the New Testament, right? When Paul says that women should remain veiled because, the angels are here. That seems to be an idea that spread kind of in the late Second Temple period, this idea that, like, where the pious people are, that's where the angels are, right? They authorize them, they give them authority. And of course, Josephus is, a fun Jewish historian, and I like him because he shares this story that right before the temple was overrun by the Romans in 70 CE, the priests heard this tumult of voices saying, let us remove ourselves, right? So like the spirit, the presence of God with the angels departed before the Romans could come to spoil the temple. So it's a good reminder that ancient Jews really believed that God and the angels were present in the temple. So that's our Second Temple period sources. Moving into late antiquity, which is really in my area of expertise, we have many important bodies of texts. So I've mentioned liturgical poetry already, the poetry of Yanai, which was preserved in the Cairo Geniza. In late antiquity, there was a very important development in the Syriac Christian tradition and in the Greek Christian tradition with Romanos and Ephraim of like these sermons that were sung. So sometimes this genre is called sung sermon. Hebrew, it's piyyut, which is clearly like a borrowed word for poetry. They're really beautiful compositions that seem to really want to invite people to pray, and not just to pray with the angels, but to pray with biblical protagonists. So you all probably know, right? There's a lectionary, right? There's a reading schedule of the Bible, changes right from week to week. And what Yanai would do is like he would, if the story was about, Genesis 18, right? The three angels visiting Abraham, he would compose the Holy, 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 the Kedushah, and it would be sung by Abraham and by the three angels whom he identifies as Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. And then it would kind of invite the whole congregation to say, Holy, 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 with the angels and with the protagonists of that week. And it would change from week to week. So there's always, multiplication of angels, always kind of different themes. And there's, the week that's devoted to Leah's story is very beautiful. Unfortunately, the ending is cut off. But the week devoted to Rachel's story is really beautiful, and in the end there's kind of like, holy from women who are barren and then remembered by God, or holy from those who were forgotten or imprisoned, and it's a really kind of inspiring, lovely genre of texts that are filled with angels. So if you're looking for angels, liturgical poetry of late antiquity, whether it's Hebrew or Greek or Syriac, is a very important tradition to look at. Now, in the last few decades, Jewish magic is increasingly accessible. So if you're looking, at Roman Palestine, you have these kind of these amulets, right? These small metal texts, you could say, that appeal to the angels for assistance. But from ancient Mesopotamia, from Babylonia, you have thousands of what are called incantation bowls. And these are, the size of cereal bowls. They're in plain ceramic. They were apparently buried under the floors of houses. Our only secure excavation site is Nippur. It was excavated in the 1920s. And so yeah, you can see the bowl there. Again, appeals to angels. You could tell that the Jews there, it's primarily Jews, apparently, they're written in Jewish and Aramaic. We also find them in Mandaic and Syriac, a few in Persian, but something like 70% of them are in Jewish Aramaic. So they primarily appeal to angels and God, and remember I mentioned the folk heroes and the kings, and that's kind of where you see that spectrum. You really get a sense of like, oh, we can't totally generalize about how Jews imagined the invisible world. Like they clearly had preferences, and in the same household, you could have, you know, a bowl commissioned by a man and, you know, and his wife because they want to secure their family, they want children. Then you also find a bowl just by the wife, and she's only asking the angels to help her. Just the angels, not like in the same household, her husband is like only appealing to God. So it's, again, even within the household, maybe with different times a day, you could have Jews kind of turning to the invisible realm, to different spiritual beings in different ways. And when I was working on my book, I just found that really helpful. We just don't usually get that kind of detail, you know, about how people imagine the world around them. And of course, you have the sea of rabbinic literature, right, which is probably the most well-studied. So I'll skip through these slides quickly. I'm happy to share them just to show you that there have been very important studies about angels in each of these texts, right? And in the Hebrew Bible, many studies in German and English on angels in the Second Temple period, on angels in rabbinic literature. So my advisor was Peter Schaeffer, who his first book and dissertation was about human and angelic rivalry. So I followed a bit in his footsteps. And I just ran into Bill Rebiger in a conference in Venice before I came here. He's also written very important work, I think also for your volume, right? Is that right? I thought maybe I'm misremembering, but. Yeah, for celestial beings, right? Did he I think, yeah. For liturgical poetry, if you want an introduction to that field, there's a really beautiful book by Laura Lieber, who's actually about to start at the University of Regensburg. So you're very lucky that you got her from, University of Regensburg got her from Duke. So I hope to visit Germany a lot more in the future so I can work with her. And then the field of ancient Jewish magic or ritual magical texts, Gidi Bohak, Shaul Shaked, sorry. There's a lot of work still to do, but a lot of great stuff is already out there and accessible and online. So that's good to look at. Of course, Targum is a very interesting place to look at angelology. Again, it's kind of the way that the Torah was translated in the synagogue gives us a really good sense of like how people understood angelic beings. Medieval mysticism as well. I decided to add that because we were talking about the medieval prophets earlier. And again, just because you heard too much about Maimonides, you should read about how strange Maimonides is when it comes to the angels and why he is not representative of most Jews in the medieval period. So yeah, don't let it. Okay, so state of the research. I would say, there are new insights to be gained that are kind of coming forth from newly published ritual magical sources, more accessible mystical sources, and that this comparative analysis between ritual magic, which used to be kind of on the periphery, is now recognized as actually being really important. That it wasn't like you have your magicians over here and your rabbis over here. There's a lot of overlap, right? It seems like it's the rabbis and the learned people that are producing the magic. You have incantation bowls that name rabbis. The people who were writing the incantation bowls are scribes. They're highly literate scribes for the most part. So it's we can't sideline this evidence as strange and unusual. It represents, right, what most people believed. And I think it gives us a better sense of what most Jews believed than just looking at rabbinic literature alone. So tracing ideas across genres is becoming more common. This book, Metatron is Not Enoch, reevaluating the evolution of an archangel. It's just like anything by this guy, Yag Kirpaz, is amazing and worth reading. Just his kind of, what is it, control, his expertise in like a number of genres and languages is really impressive. And I've mentioned, right, the idea of fallen angels. Another very popular idea is like the idea of kind of becoming an angel, and kind of the place I think look for it is Enoch, right, the biblical patriarch, and stories of him being divinized and becoming Metatron. He shows how that is kind of an 8th century Palestinian idea, which then kind of diffuses. Anyway, it's a great article. It took me until the end of writing my book to realize that there was just like little hints of feminine angels in every genre. Because I had grown up thinking, oh, angels are only masculine, like, or sexless, like there's no evidence. And then I realized, oh, actually there is enough evidence to suggest that people imagined angels not just in masculine terms. So I think it's really important that, okay, we've done all of these works of like angels book by book. Now let's see what happens when we look for ideas across the genres. And I have to cite this insights from anthropology. I recently read this book, Unfamiliar Selves in the Hebrew Bible: Possession and Other Spirit Phenomena, and I thought it was brilliant. I think that Carlson Reed really shows how studying modern exorcisms and possession can sometimes illuminate otherwise opaque texts in the Hebrew Bible. Yes, possession and exorcism is weird, but the Bible is weird, right? Like, there's strange texts in the Bible, and we shouldn't shy away from that. I think we really have to embrace that. So I think there's a lot of really interesting work being done, and not to like be self-promoting, but I'll just kind of summarize kind of what I learned from my book. What I concluded was that belief in angels as intermediaries and role models was common among late ancient Jews, and that we have to look beyond these kind of foundational texts, right? Beyond Orthodox texts. We have to look beyond rabbinic texts to understand Jewish society and culture. And looking at magical texts, at liturgical texts, even at esoteric mystical texts, is very important to get a sense of what people actually believed and what they did and what they were arguing about. And what I found over the course of my research was that rabbinic ideas about angels developed over time and in conversation with non-rabbinic Jews, right? So you can see the rabbis are reacting to ritual practitioners and to mystics and to liturgical poets, even if they don't acknowledge it, right? So, the rabbis famously don't really acknowledge the rise of Christianity, right? But obviously they're responding to it all the time. So I think when you know the evidence, you can kind of start seeing those patterns and those arguments come off the page. Okay, so you asked me for some theological and philosophical principles of spiritual beings or angels in Judaism. And this was actually the prompt I found the most difficult, because I had always told people, oh, well, Jews don't have angelology. Like, they don't have like a systematic angelology. But if you kind of force me to say, well, what would Jews agree on? So I guess that's what I try to list here. What would Jews agree on? And particularly, again, like from the 1st to 10th century, okay? Like, that's as far as I'm willing to go. They would agree that angels, both angels of good and angels of evil, were subordinate yet powerful divine beings that act in alignment with God's will. They might disagree with God's will, but they would do things anyway. And there's these lovely stories of angels weeping and crying and, being upset with how God is treating his people. So I think that's kind of worth noting. I often get asked by people, but aren't angels like automatons? They don't have their own feelings. And I'm still trying to figure out where this idea of angels as automatons came from. If any of you know, happy to hear. Angels in Jewish culture, as far as I can tell, don't have their own iconography. It is true that in all of my sources, they agree that angels are made of fire, but when they say that they're made of fire, what they seem to be suggesting is that fire can't contract impurity, fire is changeable, but they're flexible, right? They can look human, and then you realize because they dissolved into fire and clouds that it wasn't a human at all. They are gendered, like I said, masculine and feminine, although surviving sources tend to overrepresent the masculine angels. And I think because there's no intrinsic iconography, ancient craftspeople adopted foreign iconography as they needed. In other words, if you wanted to depict angels in a sarcophagus, which is pretty common, if you look at Bet She'arim, which is where most of the rabbis were buried, you find many sarcophagi with what look like Nike, right? Nike are the winged victory angels of the Hellenistic world. So starting in the Hellenistic era, I imagine that Jews imagined angels in the same way that the Greeks imagined their messenger beings, which is to say with wings. So, I'm kind of still working on this topic, so I can elaborate on that later. Other principles, angelic hierarchies. Okay, so like in the 2nd century BC, a Jew would acknowledge you have your ruling angels, either 7 or 4, right? Also called archangels, and you have everybody else. The idea of hierarchies makes sense to your ordinary ancient person because they live in a world of hierarchies, right? They live in a world of patrons and clients. And of course, right, between you and the Roman emperor, there's like a huge hierarchy. So of course, God would also have that kind of hierarchy. But you don't get Jews writing texts about those hierarchies. You don't get those kinds of angelologies, like I said, until the 10th century. Okay, so that's what I'll say about angelic hierarchies. All Jews agreed that angels carry prayers to God's throne room. Like that's their basic job. All people have guardian angels, right? That's an idea we find early on among Jews and Christians, right about the same time, I think. The idea of like a good angel, bad angel on your shoulder, like that's, I think as early as the 2nd century CE. Again, the angels of good and angels of evil, that's all over rabbinic literature. They never really explain it, but my sense of it is that you have the angels that record your good deeds. I think this is very similar in Islam, actually. And you have your angels that record your bad deeds, like your traffic cops. I like to think of them as traffic cops. Like, it's very important that somebody maintain order in the streets, but you might not like it, right? You might not like getting a ticket. You might not like somebody monitoring you, but that's the job of those angels. Not to be confused with demons, who are just chaos agents. So sometimes you can tame a chaos agent, right? And there's like rabbis that are known to tame demons, but for the most part, it's like the angels are answering to God. The demons aren't necessarily, right? Until they're put in their place by the angels. Not a ton of evidence for this last point, that angels greet departing souls at death, but I think sometimes the most popular ideas, the stuff that's totally taken for granted, just nobody really feels a need to write it down. But I think late antique Jews would agree that when you die, good angels, bad angels, that the angels greet you. Okay, so a bit on historical development. So like I said, biblical texts, obviously describe angels. So those are the foundation for belief in angels. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, already shows that the authors of Deuteronomy were concerned that Jews were paying too much attention to angels. But obviously angels were popular. They provide an alternative source of revelation, authorization, and imitation. For example, in Second Temple period texts like Jubilees, right? It's an angel that's revealing an alternative Torah. In the aftermath of the failed Jewish wars in 70 and 130s, it's very hard to trace what happened. Clearly, some Jews maybe became Christian, became pagan. Many died. Many paid attention to angels, and it was very important for the rabbis to tell Jews that your covenant with God isn't over, Okay, so you can appeal to God directly. So only the early rabbis discourage attention to angels. So that was one of the things I noticed in my book that I thought was very important, that early rabbis discourage attention to angels. Later rabbis seem to give up on that. They're like, this is a fight we are losing, so let's just like take advantage of it and tell Jews to be like the angels and, you know, prepare for the Sabbath and observe the Sabbath, etc. So again, that's what liturgical poets like Yanai did, and by the time of the redaction of the Talmud, angels are just like everywhere. Okay, so I realize I've run out of time. Okay, there's some regional differences. I guess I can skip over those. We can come back to those later. Yeah, I will say one of the most interesting differences is most Jews pray to angels politely. Mystics are really bizarre, and they think that they can command the angels. They think they have like figured out like some magical secrets to command angels, and I don't know. I'm not a fan of mystical texts, but that is like that's something that's kind of bothered me that I haven't totally been able to explain. Yeah, eventually, this idea of praying with the angels, very popular in Roman Palestine. Babylonians don't like it, it's rejected. And I'll just say that, right, production of texts that focus on angels, I guess, and demons, continues through the medieval period. Again, if you just talk to Maimonidean philosophers, you wouldn't know that. Maimonides did depersonalize and demote the angels, but both of these streams flourish at the same time. Okay, going through to the Wissenschaft. So I would say most beliefs in angels are shared with Christians and Muslims. Doesn't mean that they're not important or weren't important to Jews. Encouraging to pray with angels. You see prayer leaders in Roman Palestine, you see Christians like Cyril of Jerusalem saying almost the same stuff as, you know, as the Jews would be in the synagogue. One important difference: for Christians to be angelic, you need to be celibate, right, and sexually pure. For Jews, reproduction remained important, so you wouldn't have that. I know I should stop talking. Do you want me to just stop there? I'll just maybe end with, I'll just leave this up, this invocation of angels on all sides. This was this is part of the standard Jewish liturgy today. Our earliest example of it is found in Jewish magic bowls from the 6th century. So that's again to show that like what we find in Jewish magic isn't like, you can't just say it's weird and not really orthodox or something, right? Like it represents what people wanted, and because this was so popular, it enters the Jewish liturgy. And you see there the mention of the Shekhinah. So this idea of, right, Michael on my right, Gabriel on my left. My editor chose the title of my book, by the way. That's where it comes from. So right before me is Uriel, right, light, right? The light angel of light is before me. Raphael, the angel of healing, behind me, and above my head is the Shekhinah, right? The divine presence. So this formula isn't just in magic bowls in Jewish Aramaic. It's been found in Syriac, in Coptic, and in Arabic texts. So this was shared with Christians and Muslims very early on, and I'm sure many other ideas, you know, diffused back and forth, and we'll get to talk about those tomorrow, or I don't know, today, as you like. So anyway, thank you for your attention. Sorry I went on so long.